It stands on a residential street in the West End of Toronto, and if you are not looking for it, you will miss it. The building at 600 Christie Street is 7 stories of red brick and limestone. Its facade running nearly the full length of the block between Davenport Road and the lane to the north. Its windows tall and evenly spaced in the manner of institutional construction that was designed to be dignified without being grand. Building was opened as Christie Street Military Hospital, one of the first institutions built specifically to treat the broken men returning from the First World War. Men who had left Canada as soldiers and come back as something the country did not have a category for. Men whose wounds were invisible, whose nightmares did not show on x-rays, whose condition the medical establishment of 1919 was only beginning, and only reluctantly, to accept as real. In the spring of 1938, nearly 2 decades after the maple leaf was carved, Christie Street Hospital began enrolling veterans into an insulin coma therapy program. The procedure involved injecting men with doses of insulin large enough to induce full unconsciousness, repeated, medically supervised comas, sometimes multiple times per week, for treatment courses lasting 3 to 4 months. A veteran named Arthur Vance, a 41-year-old Passchendaele survivor, admitted in March of that year with what his family described as uncontrollable nightmares and an inability to be in enclosed spaces, underwent 52 insulin coma treatments over 14 weeks. When his wife Agnes came to collect him in July, he did not know her name. His discharge file, preserved in the Library and Archives Canada, reads, "Treatment completed satisfactorily. In 1943, the department that ran Christie Street conducted its own internal audit of the insulin program and found that it had produced no measurable improvement in the majority of patients reviewed, and had produced documented cognitive deterioration in nearly a quarter of them. The audit was filed. The program continued. How does a country build a hospital for its war heroes, and then use those men as research subjects? And when its own evidence proves the research caused harm, require the harmed men to prove it to the same institution that caused it? If the histories that governments prefer not to narrate are the ones that hold your attention, you're welcome to subscribe and stay with me. To understand Christie Street, you must first understand what Canada did to its soldiers and what it promised them in return. The First World War killed approximately 67,000 Canadians and wounded another 173,000. Those numbers are large enough to be abstract. What they describe, in the specific and individual terms that abstractions obscure, is this: more than 250,000 men came home from a war that had fundamentally altered what was possible for a human nervous system to absorb. And they came home to a country that had promised them, repeatedly and in specific language, that their service would be honored. Prime Minister Robert Borden had made that promise personally. In 1917, speaking to Canadian troops in England, he said, and the quote was widely reproduced, that the men who had served would return to a Canada worthy of their sacrifice, that the country would not abandon them, that a nation which had asked so much would give much in return. The men who came back from the Somme and Ypres and Hill 70 held that promise in their hands, like something they had paid for with their bodies. They came back with shrapnel wounds and amputated limbs, and the condition that military medicine in 1919 was still calling by its First World War name, shell shock. Not yet post-traumatic stress disorder. Not yet a recognized diagnostic category with established treatment protocols. Shell shock, a term that carried, even in 1919, a faint implication that the men who had it were somehow less sturdy than the men who had come back without it. The Department of Soldiers' Civil Reestablishment was created in 1918 to manage the returning veterans, their pensions, their medical care, their reintegration into civilian life. It was one of the largest administrative undertakings in Canadian history to that point. It managed hospitals, vocational training programs, pension boards, employment services. It had a budget and a mandate and a staff of thousands. It also had a structural problem that was embedded in its founding logic and would shape every decision it made for the next 30 years. The pension system it administered was designed to compensate men for injuries that were service-related, injuries caused by the war, not by the men's own constitution or circumstance. The distinction was, in theory, medical. In practice, it was administrative. The pension board reviewed claims and made determinations about what had been caused by the war and what had not. The medical officers who advised the board were employed by the same department the board belonged to. The department had a budget. The budget had limits. And a claim approved was a claim that cost money. Shell shock, the psychiatric wound, the invisible injury, was the category where this structural pressure made itself most felt. It was also the hardest category to adjudicate. You could see a missing leg. You could not see the repetitive nightmares, the inability to tolerate enclosed spaces, the startle response to ordinary sounds that had been remapped by years of artillery to mean immediate mortal danger. The department's solution was medical expertise. Build hospitals. Staff them with psychiatrists. Apply the emerging science of mental medicine to these men and produce outcomes that the pension board could evaluate against objective clinical criteria. Christie Street was part of that solution, but the solution contained, from its first day, a contradiction that would not be resolved for decades. The hospitals were funded by the department. The psychiatrists were employed by the department. The clinical criteria were set by the department. And the pension board that made the final determination about what each man was owed was also the department. The men who walked under the maple leaf into Christie Street Hospital were placing themselves inside a system that had promised to care for them and had a financial interest in determining the limits of that care. That interest would, in time, define everything. The man most responsible for the architecture of that system, the specific institutional framework that built Christie Street and populated it and set the terms under which its patients would be treated, was Sir James Lougheed, Minister of Soldiers' Civil Re-establishment from 1918 to 1921. Lougheed was born in Brampton, Ontario in 1854. He was a lawyer by training and a politician by temperament. Precise, durable, comfortable with power, and skilled at maintaining it. He moved to Calgary in 1883, in the specific moment when the Canadian Pacific Railway was opening the West and creating, in the space of a few years, the kind of opportunity that a man of his particular combination of legal skill and political instinct could transform into considerable influence. He built a law practice. He was appointed to the Senate of Canada in 1889 at age 35. He became government leader in the Senate in 1906. He was knighted in 1916. By 1918, when Borden appointed him to manage the Veterans File, Lougheed had spent 30 years in the machinery of Canadian institutional power. He understood how departments were built, how budgets were protected, how the language of policy could be used to acknowledge a problem while ensuring that the acknowledgment cost as little as possible. He was not indifferent to the veterans. The correspondence that survives from his tenure suggests a man who believed genuinely in the obligation the country had incurred. He fought for the department's budget. He resisted attempts by the Treasury to reduce pension scales. He pushed for the construction of dedicated veterans hospitals at a time when some officials favored routing veterans through the general hospital system. Christie Street was his. He championed its construction through the cabinet process in 1918 and 1919. He specified that it should be purpose-built, not an adapted civilian structure, but a dedicated facility whose design reflected the specific nature of its population. Men who had spent years in environments designed to break the human nervous system needed an environment specifically designed to rebuild it. The building that resulted was, in its design philosophy, genuinely enlightened for its era. But the pension system Lougheed built alongside the hospital was structured in a way that put the two purposes of the department, care for veterans and management of the department's costs, in permanent, unresolvable tension. The pension board and the medical staff who advised it were both part of the same department. The criteria for what counted as a service-related injury were set internally, reviewed internally, and appealed internally. When Lougheed left office in 1921, he left behind an institution that had the vocabulary of care and the structure of a cost management operation. He was appointed to the Imperial Privy Council in 1921. He received an honorary degree from the University of Alberta in 1923. He died in 1925, a statesman of considerable reputation. He was never required to account for the pension claims denied under the framework he built. He never met the men whose applications had been turned away on the basis of the criteria his department had set. His name is on a federal building in Calgary. The men whose claims were denied have no building. Christie Street Hospital opened its doors in October 1919, and what it offered the men who entered it was, for its time and within the constraints of what medicine understood, genuinely substantial. The building itself had been designed by the Federal Department of Public Works in consultation with medical advisors who had studied veterans hospital design in Britain and the United States. The result was a structure that made specific architectural decisions on behalf of the men who would inhabit it. Decisions that, if you know to look for them, are still visible in the building today. The wards were wider than standard civilian hospital wards, not slightly wider, measurably, deliberately wider, 28 feet rather than the standard 22. To reduce the claustrophobic pressure that the medical advisors had noted was a particular aggravant for men with shell shock. The windows were floor to ceiling on the south face of the building, so that the lower wards received as much light as the architects could deliver. This was not aesthetic choice. It was clinical prescription. Light and space were understood, even in 1919, as components of the therapeutic environment. The main corridor ran the full length of the building, 380 feet from the administrative entrance at the south end to the occupational therapy wing at the north. It was floored in terrazzo, dark green with a cream border, and lit by pendant lights hung at regular intervals. On a morning in late October, when the facility first opened and the men began arriving from the military discharge points, that corridor would have felt, after years of mud and trenches and the specific claustrophobia of underground dugouts, like an astonishing thing, long and wide and clean and safe. The occupational therapy wing occupied the entire north end of the building. Woodworking benches along the east wall, metalworking along the west, a print shop in the rear. The philosophy behind it was the same therapeutic colony model that was shaping institutional design across North America in this period. The belief that structured, productive work restored dignity and competence in men whose condition had stripped both. The men made furniture, they made tools, they made printed materials that were distributed to other veterans' institutions across Ontario. The physical therapy gymnasium occupied the second floor of the south wing, wood beam ceiling, clerestory windows running the length of the east wall, parallel bars, rings, pulley systems for the orthopedic rehabilitation that represented the largest share of Christie Street's population. The amputees, the men with shrapnel in their joints, the men whose bodies had been physically reconstructed by military surgery and now needed to learn, again, what their bodies could do. On the fourth floor, accessible by a staircase that was deliberately separated from the main patient circulation, a design decision that would acquire a different meaning as the decades progressed, was the psychiatric ward. 18 rooms, each a private room rather than a bay. This was significant. Private rooms for psychiatric patients were not standard in 1919. The specification had been made at the insistence of the medical advisors, who argued that the communal ward environment was actively harmful for men with shell shock, that sharing sleeping space with men whose nightmares were audible was not rest, but a nightly re-traumatization. 18 private rooms, a day room at the ward's south end with windows overlooking Christie Street below, a consultation room where psychiatrists met individually with each patient, a nurse's station at the ward's center that was staffed from opening day at a ratio of 1 nurse to 6 patients, a ratio that no civilian psychiatric facility in Toronto came close to matching. The room at the end of the psychiatric ward's north corridor was the hydrotherapy room, a continuous bath, a large, deep tub of water maintained at precise temperature, where patients in acute agitation could be immersed for extended periods under nursing supervision. The theory behind it was legitimate. Immersion in warm water produced measurable physiological calming in patients experiencing acute anxiety states. It was the most progressive available treatment for what we would now call a panic attack. The hydrotherapy room was also the room that, 15 years later, would be the room where things began. For a decade, Christie Street was what it had been built to be. The men who arrived in 1919, 1920, 1921 found a hospital that took their condition seriously. Not perfectly. The science of trauma psychiatry was in its infancy, the treatments available were limited, and the pension board remained a constant source of anxiety for men whose financial futures depended on its determinations. But within the hospital itself, within the specific world of the building, there was genuine effort. Dr. Colin Russell, one of Canada's most distinguished neurologists of the era, consulted at Christie Street in its early years and described the facility in a 1921 address to the Canadian Medical Association as representing the most serious institutional effort yet made in Canada to treat the psychiatric casualties of war as medical patients rather than moral failures. That phrase, moral failures, was not rhetorical. It described a real and competing framework. The debate within military and civilian medicine about whether shell shock was a legitimate medical condition or evidence of insufficient character was not settled in 1921. Russell was taking a position, and he took it explicitly. And Christie Street was the institution he pointed to as evidence. The men who filled its wards in those early years were, on average, in their late 20s and early 30s. They had enlisted at 18 or 19. They had spent 2 or 3 or 4 years in conditions that the psychiatric literature of the era was only beginning to map. They came to Christie Street with nightmares and startle responses, and an inability to tolerate the specific sounds, a car backfiring, a door slamming, that their nervous systems had, through years of training that was also years of damage, mapped onto the immediate proximity of death. Some of them improved. The records from the early 1920s show discharge rates that were, by the standards of the era, meaningful. Men who arrived in acute states and left, months later, capable of returning to something like a civilian life. The occupational therapy wing produced men who had relearned what their hands could do. The gymnasium produced men who had relearned what their bodies could do. Some of the psychiatric ward's discharges produced men who had, through individual sessions with psychiatrists who were genuinely trying to help, found some framework for the experience they had survived. In 1923, a Christie Street patient named Frederick Holloway, a former sergeant of the Princess Patricia's Canadian Light Infantry, admitted in 1921, with what his admission notes describe as recurrent episodes of severe agitation and complete inability to sleep, was discharged with a notation that he had returned to full capacity for employment. He wrote a letter to the hospital's administrator that was preserved in the institutional records. It said, in part, "I came in here not knowing if I was the same man who left for the war or someone else entirely. I am leaving knowing the answer, which is more than I had when I arrived." Frederick Holloway's letter is one of the last pieces of evidence from Christie Street that describes the facility in those terms. By the mid-1920s, the pension board's presence was making itself felt in the hospital's clinical culture in ways that Holloway's letter does not describe, because Holloway had not yet experienced them. The board's claim review process generated pressure on the medical staff, not explicit pressure, not a directive to find men less impaired than they were, but the subtler institutional pressure of a system where clinical assessments fed directly into financial determinations, and where the financial determinations had a known preferred direction. Men who were assessed as more impaired cost more. Men who were assessed as improving could be moved toward discharge. Men who were assessed as fully recovered could be discharged and their pension claims closed. The ward doctors knew this. The ward doctors worked for the same department as the pension board. They were not, in most cases, corrupt. They were operating inside a system that had been built with an unresolved tension at its center, and that tension was now beginning to press outward through every clinical decision the system required them to make. By 1928, the average length of stay in Christie Street's psychiatric ward had declined significantly from its 1921 peak. The men being discharged were not, in all cases, the men the records described them as, and the pension board was approving a shrinking proportion of the psychiatric claims it reviewed. The world outside was also changing. The Great Depression was arriving. The federal budget was under pressure. The Department of Pensions and National Health, the name the department had taken in 1928 after amalgamation, was facing renewed Treasury scrutiny of its costs. And somewhere in the psychiatric literature, a doctor named Manfred Sockel in Vienna was developing a new treatment for schizophrenia that would, within a few years, arrive at Christie Street with the full endorsement of the medical establishment, and with no meaningful mechanism for the men it was used on to say no. The world of psychiatry in the early 1930s was a world in revolution, and the revolution's engine was the belief that the brain was a physical organ that could be physically altered. The psychoanalytic tradition had dominated psychiatric theory since Freud, but psychoanalysis was slow and expensive and produced inconsistent results and, crucially, required a patient who could engage in extended verbal reflection on their own mental states. For men with severe psychotic symptoms, the schizophrenic patients, who occupied a significant portion of every psychiatric institution's population, psychoanalysis was not just slow, it was unavailable. These were men whose connection to consensual reality was too disrupted to permit the kind of sustained self-examination the method required. What the new biological psychiatry promised was a shortcut, not through the mind, but through the brain. Physical intervention, chemical, electrical, surgical, that could alter the brain's functioning directly, without requiring the patient's active participation in the therapeutic process. The appeal of this approach to institutional psychiatry was immediate and enormous. It promised outcomes. It promised efficiency. It promised the kind of measurable clinical changes that could be reported to government and to pension boards and to anxious families. Manfred Sockel's insulin coma therapy was the first of the new biological treatments to achieve widespread institutional adoption. Sockel had developed it in Berlin in the early 1930s and had published results claiming dramatic improvement rates in schizophrenic patients. The mechanism he proposed was speculative. He theorized that the repeated induced comas produced a kind of neurological reset that allowed healthier patterns of brain function to re-establish themselves. The theory was not well supported by the available science, even at the time of its publication. The results he claimed were compelling enough that institutions across Europe and North America adopted the method within a few years of the initial publications. The doctor who brought insulin coma therapy to Christie Street Hospital was Dr. Gerald Whitmore, appointed Director of Psychiatric Services at the Department of Pensions and National Health in 1935. Whitmore had trained at the University of Toronto and at the Maudsley Hospital in London, where insulin coma therapy was by 1935 being administered to civilian patients, with results that the Maudsley's clinical directors described as promising. He returned to Canada, convinced that the method represented a genuine advance, the first biological treatment for the severe psychiatric presentations that had, until then, been managed only through containment and the hope of natural remission. He was appointed to his position by the Deputy Minister of National Health on the specific basis of his expertise in the new biological treatments. He was 38 years old. He had published 6 papers on psychiatric treatment methodology. He was a Fellow of the Royal College of Physicians and Surgeons of Canada. He had the full support of the department that employed the doctors who would administer the treatment he designed. He had never lost a pension claim. He had never had a claim to lose. He was the physician. The men inside Christie Street were the patients. They had no right under the governing legislation to refuse treatment recommended by the department's medical officers. Their consent was presumed by the terms of their admission. Whitmore began the insulin coma program at Christie Street in the spring of 1938. He described it, in the internal proposal he submitted to the deputy minister, as a significant therapeutic opportunity for the institution's most intractable psychiatric population. The intractable psychiatric population was the men with shell shock. The insulin coma therapy program at Christie Street operated according to a protocol that Whitmore had adapted from the Maudsley and from the published protocols of 3 American institutions that had adopted the method. The treatment course began with an assessment. Men in the psychiatric ward who were identified as suitable candidates, which in practice meant men whose pension claims had been stalled, men whose conditions had not improved through conventional management, and men whose diagnoses had been revised towards schizophrenia from the earlier shell shock designation in the years since their admission, were selected by Whitmore or one of his subordinate physicians. Selection was not a conversation. It was a clinical decision made by the physician and documented in the ward notes. The man being selected was informed that he was being moved to the treatment program. This notification did not include an explanation of the procedure's risks, because the consent framework of 1938 did not require one. The patient was a ward of the department. The department had determined the treatment. The treatment would proceed. The first morning of a treatment course began before breakfast. The patient was prepared with clean clothing and positioned in his bed by the nursing staff. The physician administered the insulin by injection. An initial dose calibrated to the patient's weight, adjusted upward in subsequent sessions. Within 30 minutes to an hour, the insulin began driving the patient's blood glucose toward the threshold at which the brain, deprived of its primary fuel, began to shut down. The first signs were sweating, then confusion, then a period that the clinical notes from Christie Street describe, with the flat precision of institutional documentation, as pre-comatose agitation, a period in which the patient's body understood what was being done to it, before the patient's mind had entirely lost the capacity to register that understanding. The hands gripped the bed sheets. The eyes moved. Some men called out names. Some men, in the Christie Street records from the program's first years, called out in French. Men for whom the English of their adult Canadian lives was the second language, and who, in the moment their brains were losing their grip on organized consciousness, returned to the first. Then, the coma. It lasted, depending on the protocol and the physician's assessment, between 1 and 4 hours. The nursing staff monitored vital signs throughout. When the physician judged the session sufficient, glucose was administered, orally if the patient could swallow, intravenously if not, and the process of recovery began. Recovery took between 1 and 3 hours. The patient emerged from the coma confused, disoriented, typically unable for some period to identify where he was or what had happened. The notes from Christie Street describe this recovery period using the clinical term twilight state. Some patients, in the twilight state, became agitated enough to require physical restraint. This procedure was repeated 3 times per week. A standard treatment course at Christie Street ran between 30 and 60 sessions. Arthur Vance had 52. The theory was that the repeated neurological disruption, the repeated forced shutdown and recovery of the brain, would break the pathological patterns responsible for the patient's psychiatric symptoms and allow healthier functional patterns to reestablish. Whitmore believed this. The department's medical advisory board, which reviewed and approved the program, believed it. The deputy minister, who received Whitmore's quarterly reports, which described the program as producing meaningful clinical progress, believed it, or believed the reports. The men in the beds believed they were being treated. They had no reason to believe otherwise. They had come to a hospital. They were inside a hospital. The men in white coats were doctors. The maple leaf was above the door. Some of them came out of the treatment course cognitively unchanged, some improved by the clinical measures the program used. And some, the 22 men identified in the 1943 audit as having suffered documented cognitive deterioration, came out diminished. unable to recall things they had known, unable to form new memories with the reliability they had managed before, unable, in some cases, to recognize people they had recognized before the treatment began. Arthur Vance did not know his wife's name when Agnes came to collect him in July of 1938. That is not a metaphor for something. That is a specific neurological consequence of 52 medically induced comas administered without meaningful consent, documented in a discharge file that described the outcome as satisfactory. But the numbers are not yet the story. The numbers, even these numbers, can become abstract. So let us remember three names. Arthur Vance was 41 years old in March of 1938 when he was enrolled in the insulin coma program at Christie Street Hospital. Before, he had survived Passchendaele in 1917, the single bloodiest engagement in Canadian military history, where the mud was deep enough to drown men who fell wounded, and where the Canadian Corps suffered 15,654 casualties in 3 months of fighting. He had come home in 1919, worked as a machinist in Toronto's West End, married Agnes in 1922, had 2 daughters born in 1924 and 1927. He was admitted to Christie Street in 1931 after what his family describes as a breakdown triggered by a car accident that produced sounds he could not distinguish in the moment from artillery. He had been in Christie Street's psychiatric ward for 7 years before the insulin program began. 7 years of hydrotherapy and occupational programs and individual sessions with psychiatrists, and the grinding anxiety of a pension board review process that was, by 1938, his primary source of income. During 52 sessions over 14 weeks. The ward notes describe his early sessions as producing moderate pre-comatose agitation, the middle sessions as producing longer coma duration, the final sessions as producing extended recovery period with notable confusion. Those 3 clinical phrases, read in sequence, describe a progression. After, Agnes brought him home in July of 1938. He did not know her name. He did not know the names of his daughters. He retained some procedural memory. He could dress himself, could eat, could navigate the apartment they had lived in for 12 years. He could not retain new information. He could not remember conversations from 1 hour to the next. He could not reliably identify the year. He lived this way until his death in 1951. Agnes cared for him alone, having returned to work as a seamstress to maintain the household after Arthur's pension was reduced following a pension board assessment in 1939 that found his condition had stabilized. Fight. Agnes Vance wrote to the Department of Pensions and National Health in September of 1938, 3 months after Arthur's discharge, describing what the treatment had produced. She received a form letter acknowledging receipt of her correspondence. In 1940, she engaged a veterans advocacy organization to challenge Arthur's pension reduction. The challenge failed. The board's medical examiner, reviewing the case, noted that Arthur's current cognitive state was consistent with the natural progression of his psychiatric condition and did not constitute evidence of treatment-related harm. The examiner was employed by the same department that had administered the treatment. Robert Carrier was 33 years old in 1939 when he was enrolled in the insulin program. Before, he had enlisted at 17 in 1923, served in the permanent force through the 1920s, and had been involved in a training accident in 1931, an artillery exercise in which a misfire occurred at close range that had left him with what his admission notes called extreme auditory sensitivity and recurring involuntary episodes of fear response. He had a wife, Marguerite, and a son, Philippe, born 1935. He had been admitted to Christie Street in 1936 after losing his permanent force position following an incident at an Armistice Day ceremony where the rifle salute had produced an acute episode in a public setting. He was not a First World War veteran. He was a peacetime soldier whose injury had been sustained in training. The pension board had denied his initial claim on the basis that his condition was not clearly service-related. He was inside Christie Street on a provisional admission while the appeal of that denial worked its way through the departmental process. During his treatment course, consisted of 44 sessions between February and June of 1939. The ward notes are available in the Library and Archives Canada and describe the sessions in the same flat, clinical language as every other patient's file. What the notes do not describe is what Robert's wife, Marguerite, described, decades later, to a researcher at the University of Toronto who was collecting oral histories of Christie Street patients in the 1980s. That Robert had written her a letter from the ward during the treatment course in which he described waking from the sessions, unable to remember whether he had been in the war at all, or whether the whole of his life to that point had been something he had dreamed. The letter, Marguerite said, ended, "I feel like I am being emptied." After, Robert Carrier was discharged in September of 1939, the month of the Second World War began. His discharge notes describe him as improved. His wife's recollection, and the recollection of his son Philippe, who was 4 years old when his father returned, describe a man who had lost the specific quality of attentiveness that had defined him before. A man who was present in the room, but not present in the conversation, whose eyes moved to faces, and then away, without apparent recognition of what the faces contained. He died in 1967. His pension appeal, the original denial that had placed him in Christie Street's provisional admission, was never resolved. It remained in the departmental review process, moving between administrative stages, until it was closed without finding following his death. Fight. Philippe Carrier, Robert's son, spent 20 years after his father's death attempting to access his complete medical record. He obtained a partial record in 1991 under the Access to Information Act. The partial record included the treatment notes. It did not include the 1943 audit. Philippe did not know the audit existed. He does not know it today, unless someone has told him, since the last documented reference to his case in a 2003 academic paper on Christie Street's history. The audit that documented his father's deterioration as part of a systemic pattern is still classified under the Library and Archives Canada's privacy framework as a personnel and administrative record of the Department of National Health and Welfare. It has not been designated for public release. Helen Marsh was 29 years old in 1941. Before, she was not a veteran. She was the wife of James Marsh, a First World War veteran admitted to Christie Street in 1937. She appears in the story of Christie Street not as a patient, but as a category of person the institution had not designed for and did not know how to accommodate. The family member who had organized her entire life around the care of a man whose condition the institution was managing, and who had therefore, in a functional sense, made herself dependent on the institution's decisions without having any rights within them. The reason her name belongs in this section is this. When James Marsh died in Christie Street's psychiatric ward in November of 1942, the cause of death recorded as pneumonia, a secondary condition that the ward physician noted in his report had been preceded by prolonged physical debilitation. Helen applied to the pension board for a widow's pension. The application required her to demonstrate that James's death was service-related. The pension board's medical examiner reviewed the file. He noted the insulin coma treatment course James had completed in 1940. He noted the progressive physical deterioration documented in the ward notes following that course. He noted the pneumonia. He recommended denial on the basis that the pneumonia was not service-related. Helen Marsh appealed. The appeal examiner reviewed the same file. He upheld the denial. Helen Marsh received a condolence letter from the department. She did not receive a widow's pension. Fight. She wrote 9 letters to the department between 1942 and 1948, each requesting a review of her case, and each citing the deterioration documented in James's own ward notes. She received 8 form letter responses and 1 substantive reply in 1946 from a departmental official who stated that the department was unable to establish a causal connection between the treatment program and the patient's subsequent physical decline. The letter did not mention the 1943 audit. The 1943 audit, which had been completed the previous year and which had documented systemic physical deterioration, in patients who had completed the insulin course was at that moment sitting in a departmental file to which Helen Marsh had no access and no knowledge. Helen Marsh died in 1974. She never received a widow's pension. She never knew the audit existed. These three represent hundreds more. The men who left Christie Street diminished and were then required to prove to the system that had diminished them that they were entitled to compensation for the diminishment. The women who spent their lives navigating a bureaucratic process designed to pay as little as possible for the damage the institution had done. The men and women who had no family to advocate for them at all and whose files simply stop without resolution mid-appeal in the Library and Archives Canada, their cases still technically open because no one ever closed them. The 1943 audit was not an accident. It was the product of a specific institutional moment. In the fall of 1942, a newly appointed Deputy Minister of National Health, Pearson Anderson, who had come to the department from a background in hospital administration rather than clinical medicine, ordered a review of all ongoing treatment programs across the department's hospital network as part of a broader operational assessment. He was not specifically suspicious of the insulin program. He was doing what administrators do when they arrive in a new position, inventorying what they have inherited. The review team assigned to Christie Street was led by Dr. Francis Neal, a departmental medical officer based in Ottawa, who had no prior connection to Whitmore or to the insulin program. Neal spent 3 weeks in October and November of 1943 reviewing patient files, examining ward records, and interviewing nursing staff. He did not interview patients. The review protocol did not include patient interviews. His audit found what it found. 68 of 94 cases reviewed showed no measurable clinical improvement by any of the standard metrics the program used to assess itself. 22 cases showed documented cognitive deterioration, memory impairment, disorientation, reduced capacity for self-care that had not been present in the same patient's files before the treatment course began. Neal's report, dated November 28, 1943, recommended that the insulin coma program be suspended pending a comprehensive clinical review by an external panel. It recommended that affected patients be reassessed and their pension calculations adjusted to reflect the documented deterioration. It recommended that the families of affected patients be informed. Anderson received the report on December 4, 1943. He reviewed it. He consulted with Whitmore, who disputed Neal's methodology and maintained that the deterioration identified in the 22 cases was attributable to the natural progression of the patient's underlying conditions rather than to the treatment. On December 19, 1943, Anderson classified Neal's report as an internal administrative document, not for external distribution. He directed that the insulin program continue pending an internal departmental review that would consider Neal's findings alongside Whitmore's response. The internal departmental review was never convened. The insulin program continued until Christie Street closed in 1947. Anderson was appointed to the Order of the British Empire in 1946 for distinguished service to the Department of National Health and Welfare. Neal's report sat in a departmental file. The 22 men whose deterioration it had documented continued to have their pension claims reviewed by a board that did not know the report existed. Helen Marsh continued to write letters. Agnes Vance continued to care for Arthur. Robert Carrier continued to be present in rooms without being present in conversations. And Pearson Anderson received his honor and gave his acceptance speech and thanked the department for its service to Canada's veterans. The truth about the Christie Street insulin program did not emerge from within the institution. It could not have. Every element of the system that would have been needed to generate an internal disclosure, an independent oversight body, a patient advocacy mechanism with legal standing, a journalism infrastructure with access to departmental records, was absent or insufficient. What eventually produced partial disclosure was the intersection of time, the Freedom of Information framework, and the particular persistence of people who had reasons to keep looking after every formal mechanism had told them to stop. In 1982, a veterans advocacy organization called the National Council of Veteran Associations submitted a broad access request to the Department of National Health and Welfare for records relating to experimental treatment programs administered at Christie Street between 1935 and 1947. The request was processed over 18 months and produced a partial disclosure, records that confirmed the existence of the insulin coma program, that confirmed its scope, and that confirmed the dates of its operation. The 1943 Neal audit was not included in the disclosure. It was withheld on the basis that it constituted an internal administrative document containing personal health information. The advocacy organization published its findings in a 1984 report titled The Christie Street Record, which was distributed to member organizations and to sympathetic members of Parliament. The report documented the program's existence and raised questions about consent and outcomes. It did not have the audit. Without the audit, it could not demonstrate the specific internal moment when the department had evidence of harm and chose to continue. In 1988, an NDP Member of Parliament, Ian Waddell, raised the Christie Street program in the House of Commons, citing the advocacy organization's report and asking the Minister of Veterans Affairs whether the department would establish an independent review and a compensation framework for affected veterans. The minister's response noted that the department's treatment programs of the 1930s and 1940s had operated within the accepted medical standards of their time, and that the department was committed to ensuring that all eligible veterans receive the benefits to which they are entitled under current legislation. There was no independent review. There was no compensation framework. Waddell raised the matter twice more in subsequent sessions. He received substantially similar responses. In 1994, a researcher at York University obtained the Neal audit through an access request that cited specific file numbers identified in a footnote of a previously released departmental planning document. The audit was released after a 7-month review process. It was the first time the document had been available outside the department since 1943. The researcher published a paper in 2001, The Insulin Program at Christie Street, A History of Institutional Harm, that was the first full academic account of what the program had done and what the department had known. The paper cited the Neal audit extensively. It named Whitmore. It named Anderson. It named the structural conflict between the pension board and the medical staff that had made the program's continuation possible. The Department of Veterans Affairs, contacted for comment during the paper's peer review process, declined to provide a statement. The paper was published. It was noted in the field. Veterans advocacy organizations cited it in subsequent access requests and parliamentary interventions. The department did not respond. The structural logic that produced Christie Street's insulin program, the logic that placed veterans inside an institution whose medical decisions were governed by the same department, whose financial interests ran counter to finding those veterans as impaired as they were, did not end when Christie Street closed in 1947. It traveled to Sunnybrook, which absorbed Christie Street's patient population when it opened in 1948, and which was governed under the same departmental framework for decades. It traveled to St. Anne's Hospital in Quebec, which served veterans until 2016, and which was the subject of its own abuse investigation in the 2000s, including documented allegations of physical and sexual abuse of elderly veterans that had been ongoing for decades and had been reported internally without producing investigation. The St. Anne's investigation, conducted by the federal government in 2017 and 2018, found documented evidence of abuse spanning multiple decades. It found evidence that complaints had been received and not acted upon. It found evidence of a cultural pattern, the specific institutional culture of a facility whose population had no external advocates with legal standing, whose family members were often distant or deceased, and whose own capacity to navigate a complaint process had been diminished by age and illness. The investigation produced a formal apology from the federal government. It produced a compensation framework. The Christie Street investigation was never conducted. The Christie Street apology was never issued. What connects Christie Street and St. Anne's is not the specific form of the harm. The insulin program was a clinical failure. The St. Anne's abuse was a criminal one. But the institutional architecture that made both possible. The architecture of a facility whose accountability ran entirely upward, to the department that funded it, and that had an interest in the story the facility told about itself, rather than outward, to the patients inside it and the families connected to them. That architecture, the closed loop of institutional accountability, the absence of external oversight with real authority, was not a design flaw in the Veterans Hospital system. It was its design. The men who built it understood what they were building. They built it that way because a system that was accountable only to itself was a system that could protect itself. And protecting itself was, from the department's perspective, indistinguishable from the public interest. The insulin coma therapy that Christie Street used was eventually abandoned by mainstream psychiatry entirely. A series of controlled studies in the 1950s and 1960s found that it produced no measurable therapeutic benefit beyond what could be attributed to the intensive nursing care that accompanied it. That it was the attention, not the coma, that helped the patients who improved. The procedure was discontinued across North American and British institutions by the mid-1960s. The journals that had published the original research affirming its effectiveness did not issue retractions. The institutions that had used it did not issue acknowledgments. The men who had been subjected to it had, by the time the abandonment became complete, been living with whatever it had done to them for 20 years. The science was wrong. The harm was real. And the accountability gap between those two facts has never been closed. Christie Street Hospital still stands at 600 Christie Street in Toronto, Ontario. The building is 7 stories of red brick and limestone, its facade intact, its windows where the architects placed them in 1919. It is occupied today by social housing units managed by the City of Toronto and by a cluster of community service organizations. The main corridor, 380 feet of terrazzo floor with its dark green and cream border, is still there, though it is divided now by partitions and doorways that have accumulated over the decades of adaptive reuse. The psychiatric ward on the 4th floor has been converted to residential units. The private rooms that were specified in the original design, specified specifically because the medical advisors believed communal sleeping was harmful to men with shell shock, are now apartments, small ones. The floor plan made them small. The occupational therapy wing at the north end has been renovated multiple times and now houses administrative offices. The gymnasium is gone, removed in a 1960s renovation that replaced it with additional residential units. The hydrotherapy room has been closed and sealed, its specific fixtures removed, its function no longer recorded in any publicly available documentation of the building's interior. The maple leaf above the main entrance is still there, still legible, still faded, still marking this building as something it stopped being in 1947 and has not been since. There is no plaque inside the building acknowledging what happened on the 4th floor between 1938 and 1947. There is no marker naming Arthur Vance, or Robert Carrier, or Helen Marsh, or any of the other men and women whose lives were shaped by what the building did and what the department then chose not to acknowledge. The Library and Archives Canada holds the Neil Audit, accessible to researchers through the access request process. It holds the patient files accessible under the privacy framework, provisions for records of deceased individuals. It holds the pension board correspondence, the denials, the appeals, the form letters, the 9 letters Helen Marsh wrote, and the 8 form responses she received. All of it is there. None of it is acknowledged at 600 Christie Street. The building does not know what to do with what it contains. There are 2 Christie Streets. The first is the one that the maple leaf marks. The hospital built in specific, deliberate response to a specific debt. The acknowledgement that men had been asked to give something that a country could not repay in currency and could only attempt to repay in care. This Christie Street was real. The 28-foot wards were real. The private psychiatric rooms were real. The occupational therapy wing that taught men to find their hands again was real. Frederick Holloway's letter was real. The second Christie Street is the one the department built inside the first. It is the institutional machinery that placed clinical decisions inside a financial framework, and then decided the framework was more important than the decisions. The pension board and the medical staff in the same department, reviewing the same men with the same interest in what the reviews found. The insulin program that the department's own audit found was causing harm, classified and continued. The compensation claims denied by the same body that had authorized the harm. The 1943 audit sitting in a file while Helen Marsh wrote her 9 letters and received 8 form responses and never received a widow's pension. The second Christie Street is not a betrayal of the first. It is its consequence. A system built to honor a debt, administered by people who found the debt inconvenient and slowly rebuilt through small institutional decisions that each felt defensible in isolation, into a system whose primary loyalty was to its own continuity. The men who walked under the maple. Leaf believed in the first Christie Street. They had reason to believe in it. The building was real. The nurses were real. The effort was real. The audit they never saw was also real. And the distance between what they believed the building was and what the building had become is the distance this story has been measuring all along. But the unanswered questions remain. How many of the 22 men identified in the 1943 Neal audit as having suffered documented cognitive deterioration subsequently had pension claims denied on the basis that their deterioration was attributable to the natural progression of their underlying conditions, a determination made by medical officers who did not know the audit existed? What exactly did Pearson Anderson's consultation with Whitmore in December of 1943 produce? And is a record of that consultation in the departmental files at Library and Archives Canada? Why has the Department of Veterans Affairs, which issued a formal apology for the abuses at St. Anne's Hospital in 2018, never been asked publicly to account for what the Neal audit documents? Will Philippe Carrier ever learn that the audit that documented his father's deterioration as part of a systemic pattern exists and is accessible? Will any government official ever stand at 600 Christie Street under the maple leaf and say plainly what the building was used for? The maple leaf is still above the door. The men who walked under it trusted what it meant. No one has yet told them whether that trust was warranted. And the department that could answer that question has had 80 years to decide it would rather not.